In the last video, I talked about the O'Shea cousins who carved the stone in Oxford University Museum of Natural History. And today I wanted to go about 20 to 25 miles north of Oxford to a village called Bloxham, which is just outside of Banbury. It's a bit outside of the Cotswolds, and it's not really in Oxford, but it's overall sort of in the area of them both. I want to talk about the church here, St. Mary's. As I mentioned at the end of the last video, it has some fantastic creatures carved into it. I also want to talk a little bit about smallpox and the isolation hospital that was here in Bloxham. Quick overview of St. Mary's. The chancel, which is the core of the church, was built in the 1200s, and there are some zigzag and beakhead moldings in the chancel from around the 1100s, just after the Norman invasion, that were used in an earlier church on the site and then repurposed in this one. But it's the outside of the church that I wanted to talk about. The tower has a collection of carvings around it, and when these were done, in around 1300 to 1340, around the time that the tower was completed, the 200-foot tall steeple was added later. So I'm referencing for today a booklet by Yvonne Huntriss about the church. So she has a wonderful line about the steeple saying it's an inspiration of vision above everyday materialism. So this is Yvonne's booklet, and she also wrote a larger booklet about Old Bloxham. Well, starting from right to left, there are two musicians. The one on the far right is cut off by a shadow, but it's a man playing handbells, I believe. The next one over is playing a stringed instrument, probably a psaltery or a harp. A psaltery is like a harp, except in a harp the strings are in open space, and a psaltery the strings are in front of a wooden box that resonates the sound. And the reason I say it's probably a psaltery is that this carving is almost identical to another one that's up the road at Atterbury, where there is both a psaltery and a harp next to each other. And then we have a lion, fairly typical carving for medieval churches at this point. And then we come to my favorite one, and you can probably guess what it is. Yeah, it's a monkey doctor carrying a beaker of urine. And there are more monkey doctors running around the bottom of the parapet. So why is it here? Who came up with the idea of a monkey doctor? To answer this, maybe we have to go back to around the year 1300, when around the time when these are carved. Physicians were trained in the art of diagnosis. Feeling a patient's pulse, examining urine were common practices, and they were particularly attentive to what they called the humors, or the bodily fluids. Doctors at the time were often shown in manuscripts raising a urine flask for inspection. And that's the inspiration for the joke here. Treatments were rudimentary. They had no medicine that we would recognize today. Bloodletting was a common practice. It was a respected profession, but these doctors of physic, as they were called, well, anyway, clearly the stone masons had their own point of view about them. And the monkey doctor motif isn't unique to this church. It appears in paper manuscripts and also appears in the pilgrimage window in York Minster, also done from around the same time. But it is unique to see one carved into the stone in the side of a church. Now, here I'm looking at it, of course, with a telephoto lens and a camera. From the ground, it's hard to see, especially if your eyesight needs a little bit of help. So, did anyone see it in the 1300s? Well, I think so, because all of these carvings, these grotesques, as they were called, at the time were painted. So the beaker of urine would have been one color, maybe yellow, and that would have popped out on a background of red. The monkey could have been painted red with black features, for example. There are a couple of other carvings outside the church that are also really quite incredible. Just underneath here is a man holding a short club, his wife holding her wool spinning distaff, chasing a fox who has taken a goose, which is really just a fantastic storyline for an entire carving on the side of a church. It's believed that Banbury was the center for a school of stonemasons in the early 1300s. And so these were really artists and of the highest order that are carving on the side of this church. Another carving is above the west door of the tower closest to the road. It's of the Last Judgment, showing the souls of the damned caught in the open jaws of the underworld like an alligator. It's really quite striking. And if you walk behind the church, there's a dip in the field just beyond. And a couple of feet or so underneath the soil, throughout the Cotswolds, is a deep layer of limestone. So they took stone for the church from this field, leaving a resulting crater, which is still there today. But that's how they built all of the stone walls, for example, that run through the Cotswold countryside. They dig down a foot or two, break off bits of bricks of limestone, and build them into a dry stone wall right there in the same spot. So there was very little carting of stone or any other materials needed to build those stone walls. Well, as I mentioned, I'm getting a lot of the information about Bloxham from a couple of books by Yvonne Huntriss, and she wrote them in the mid-1990s when she was in her mid-70s at the time. She was the founder of the Bloxham Museum, which is still around today, right by the church, and known for her historical work with the community, and for that she was awarded an MBE. And in some of her books, she talks about the so-called plague path that runs behind the church through the fields. This field we just looked at was the end of the plague path. There was an isolation hospital amongst the trees about 100 meters behind where the recreation ground is now, on the A361. As you drive into town, it was there from the mid-1700s to the late 1800s. So when somebody came down with an infectious disease, they weren't allowed in the village or near the church, and they would stay in the pest house. And if they died, their body still wasn't allowed in the village or near the church, so they would have to carry them in a loop that went east and then turned north into the fields, into the field that we looked at, over a wall to be buried in the bottom of the church graveyard. Your family could drop off food for you while you were in the pest house. There would be a doctor or a nurse on staff, or fever nurses they were called. The main diseases at that time were smallpox, scarlet fever, and typhoid. Typically, tuberculosis cases weren't allowed in those types of hospitals. Tuberculosis patients would have to go to a special sanatorium. Well, in my last video, I talked about the Oxford University Museum of Natural History and some of the other monkey carvings in the area. In the next video, I will visit a tuberculosis sanatorium location and discuss the story of one of its most famous residents, who was finalizing the edits of a book while he was a patient there, one of the most well-known books of all time. See you then.